The Toronto Maple Leaf situation involving Mitch Marner continues to create controversy and questions. We'll talk about that, plus two of the teams that had big draft days over the weekend. All that and more next on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Leafs, David Morassutti. And David, wow, what a week this is going to be and has been so far for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let's start with the whole Mitch Marner situation because it got a little crazy, let's say, during the draft. Rumors about a possible trade to Vegas, rumors about accusations of tampering. What's going on and where do we stand as of right now?
Yeah, it was kind of out of nowhere that you see Elliot Friedman, Darren Dreger both say that, the Leafs had discussed a sign and trade with Vegas because we know that Vegas was among one of the favorites to be a destination for Mitch Marner heading into free agency. I think it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that Marner's not going to be returning to Toronto. He is going to be looking at alternatives in free agency. So obviously there was, people were saying, could the Leafs try to get something back from Marner? And, if you're Vegas, yeah, let's try to get Marner locked in before, July 1. Let's make sure no other teams get a chance to throw an offer at him. And then things took a little bit of a turn because Elliot Friedman brought up that, part of the reason Leafs were doing this is if Marner were to go to Vegas, there's a possibility that they could file tampering charges against Vegas. And this is an interesting one because it's not often that we know tampering happens. We know tampering. That's why they did the whole legal free, 48-hour window for free agents to go and look around and sign with team and no, not sign, just have those conversations. But we know that conversations are usually always happening. And in the Leafs case, I think there's some frustration here because they had discussed potentially doing a deal with Vegas last offseason. They threw in, hey, would Shea Theodore get it done? And Vegas is like, no, we kind of like Shea Theodore. And they ended up signing him for a long-term deal. And I wonder if the Leafs thought twofold of this. One, does Vegas have this belief of, why would we trade a significant part of our roster if we feel we can get Mitch Marner a year from now in free agency? And Marner has a no movement clause. And I'm sure the Leafs went to Marner and say, if we were to go and make a deal, would you waive your no movement clause? And I'm sure the agent probably said, yeah, you know what, Vegas, we would probably do Vegas. So I think the Leafs are probably looking at this like, yeah, we're not going to let Vegas just get away with, taking our best player when it probably looked like that was something that had already kind of been in the works a little bit here. It's tough, to prove that, obviously, but I think you're not throwing out the T word if you don't think you have a case, right? Or potentially have a case to grieve. So Vegas now has to be very careful with this. And the agent for Mitch Marner also has to be careful because if anything looks fishy, the NHL has made it known, and they told teams a few days ago, if you tamper, this is what you face. So that's something that I think is important here. That the league has already said this is what could happen if you are caught tampering.
So, well, first of all, what will happen if you are caught tampering? What is this?
Yeah, I think at a team level, the punishment can be, I think the fine is up to $5 million. Sometimes the contract could be terminated and voided. Depending on how serious they deem it is, you could forfeit draft picks, and the Leafs could get draft picks from Vegas, and the players can also be penalized too. It's not just the league. The league could say, "All right, we're going to let you keep the contract, but guess what? You're going to face a fine, or you could be suspended." Now, depending on how serious it is, there is the possibility that a team could lose the player, like the player could be expelled from the league. Again, that's a serious case. I don't think we're at that point. Like, I don't think Mitch Marner, that would probably have to be like Mitch Marner had already come to an agreement with Vegas well before free agency. And again, you have to prove that that's happened. This is where like communication with the agent and the team would have to be revealed. So yeah, this is a very delicate situation. And if the league is serious about cracking down on this, man, it could be a pretty interesting wrinkle. Maybe also, and as Elliot Friedman put it, a chance for the league to send a bit of a message. Like they don't want to find teams tampering. They don't want teams to tamper. But if there is that going on, they want to make someone an example.
Would you think that puts some pressure on Vegas to get a deal done?
I think so. I mean, if you're Vegas, if you go out and you sign Mitch Marner, and it's going to be, I think the reports were saying maybe it could be at $12 million a year. You can't afford that right now. You need to make a deal to free up space. Now, there's the rumblings that Alex Pietrangelo could be not able to play, and that's how they're gonna make some space. But the Vegas has to make, if they want to replace Pietrangelo and add Marner into the fold, they're gonna have to make some moves to clear cap space. That's why the sign and trade was brought up. A guy like Nicholas Roy, who makes I think $3 million the next 2 years. That's a luxury for Vegas to have a player like that in their bottom six. That $3 million could be better used for them to go and sign a guy like Mitch Marner.
The draft passed right now. Toronto did not have a first-round pick, but they did have second and third-round picks. Any of the players selected in the draft stand out to you?
I think I wouldn't say a specific player stood out, but it was clear what the Leafs' intentions were with this draft. And it's the first draft with Mark Leach, who was brought over from the Dallas Stars. That this was his first one ever. And every single player is over 6 feet. Every single one. There's only one player that's under 6'3". Everything else 6'3" and up. So it's clear size was an important factor, and the Leafs only took one defenseman. Now they didn't have a lot of high picks, but they made it clear that they wanted to go out and get size. And there's a few guys who are viewed as projects. When you're the Leafs and you don't have high picks, these are you take shots in the dark and hope you turn something into nothing into something, as some would say. So I think the fact that size was a big one for them, and they want to go with a different path than what they've done before, because the draft has not been too kind for Leafs. Yes, they have gotten great players like the Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, William Nylanders of the world, but those are guys that were picked in the top 10. You as an organization need to find ways to make it outside of the first round be something that you can be proud of and see some results in how you build your team going forward.
Free agency coming up. The Maple Leafs took care of two of their own free agents already. What else do you expect to happen? And talk to me about the impact of those two signings, first of all.
Yeah, first off, John Tavares and Matthew Knies. I think this is one of the few times where it's almost 99% of Leafs fans are ecstatic about these contracts, because John Tavares, getting him at under $5 million, at $4.38 million a year over the next 4 years, that's a big win for Toronto, because he's still a productive player. Obviously, he's getting into the older part of his career, so you can't be expecting to pay him what he was getting before. So he took, and he said, I probably left money on the table, but he wasn't complaining about it. And I think that's something that Leafs fans really appreciate. Then you get Matthew Knies, your emerging young, talented forward. You got him for the next 6 years, and you got him at $7.75 million. Like, considering what we were hearing throughout the year, a lot of analysts are saying, yeah, this is something that's going to cost the Leafs 8, 9, maybe even 10 million, depending on where they think this is going. And I'm sure a lot of fans would like to get the full 8-year term, but to get him for 6, you get this guy locked up at his best years at a really reasonable number. It not only helps you going into free agency to know what these guys are making, but to know that you've got important parts of your team not only coming back, but at numbers that you can easily say, this works for us. Now we can go out and add. And adding is not going to be easy because the targets that they have are going to be a bit ambitious. Brad Marchand is like the number one guy right now. Everyone, it's funny. If you told me a few years ago that Brad Marchand would be a number one target, not only for the Leafs front office, but for the fan base, somebody might give me a few harsh words, but that's kind of where things are right now. They got decent cap space to go out and get a Marchand, but they're going to have some competition for him, especially from Florida, and apparently Boston has thrown their ring in a little bit. But the Leafs, there should be a little bit of hope that they can do things a little differently. Obviously, letting Mitch Marner allowed this to happen. You have to kind of replace him in some way. You're not going to replace him with one player, but maybe you can get a few guys that can help contribute.
Going to be an interesting week in Toronto. David, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube at Locked On Leafs. You can follow myself on X at @D_Morassutti, 2 S's, 2 T's. And you can also follow my co-host, Mike DeSeva, at Mickey_Canuck.
All right, David, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to get started today. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Sharks, JD Young. And JD, you've got to be pleased with the Sharks draft. It was one of the highest rated drafts by almost every expert panel. What stood out to you about the way the Sharks handled this draft?
Mike Grier, he went for upside. This was definitely a draft where maybe you thought he might go a little bit more kind of meat and potatoes to try to fill some needs or fill some holes, especially at right-handed defense in the pipeline. But Grier swung for upside. Of course, you start with Michael Misa, who was picked number 2, considered the best forward in the draft. Might be considered a Celebrini type of clone in the style that he plays, that full 200-foot game, but also just his style and his skill in the offensive zone, but then the details in the defensive zone, as we saw Celebrini, very impressive season his first season in the NHL. They followed up by getting Joshua Ravensbergen, considered the best goalie in the class, even though right, you have Askarov, who's considered to be your long-term starter and should be the Sharks starter opening night this season. But he thought the opportunity to continue to add to the pipeline there just too good to pass up. Getting a guy like Simon Wang in the second round, who very raw prospect, but 6 foot, almost 6'7", 230 pounds, and one of the best skaters in the class. If he hits, it feels like it could be a potential massive win there. So this class, I think, was marked by just swinging for upside and maybe not playing it safe with some of the picks. There could have been some potential options there, but I feel like Grier knows exactly how he wants to build this team, and he has been doing that the last couple seasons. And I think we saw it again this year.
As far as Michael Misa is concerned, where do you see him how far off is he from the NHL? Is there a chance he plays this year? And if not, what do you see him doing?
Yeah, that's a big question with Misa, right? Is a lot of these other top prospects are already kind of committed to going to schools. Misa, who I think is clearly too good to be going back to the OHL next year after putting up 62 goals and 134 points in 65 games. I think the Sharks are going to give him every opportunity to play in the NHL next year. Whether they maybe follow the Will Smith, kind of road of, being very careful the first half of the season. Maybe you're giving him development days. Maybe he's not playing in back-to-back games. Then kind of the second half of the season, as he gets more accustomed to playing NHL life, you take the training wheels off and let him go. And Will Smith had a very successful second half of the season. And I think for Misa, you could potentially do that as well. Or if they don't, if they feel like he's not ready, maybe you send him to college, keep him from signing a ZLC until literally the last possible minute that you can. That way he can have the option of going to college. And you look at, I think any school in the nation would be happy to grab Michael Misa. His brother Luke Misa is going to be going to Penn State this year, so there's maybe an opportunity to go there, play with his brother. There's rumors Gavin McKenna, who's supposed to be the 2026 top pick in the draft, is potentially looking at Penn State as well. Mike Greer, he loves those Boston schools, so I'm sure he'd be happy to push Misa that way. Those schools always have top end prospects. So I think it's the Sharks are going to do what they think is right for Misa. But I would assume it's either the NHL or NCAA would be my two guesses for Misa next year.
As far as sleepers are concerned in this draft, maybe a pick not in the first round that you really think has some potential.
I'm going to go with Simon Wang, who I did mention earlier. Like I said, big boy, kind of got to hockey a little bit later. The highest born Chinese player. Didn't put up amazing production in the OHL, but again, that raw prospect for him. Great one. First of all, great story. It just kind of, being a Chinese immigrant going over to Canada at the age of 14 and really falling in love with hockey, and kind of wasn't until that time when he really got into hockey, kind of full time. But first of all, the way he kind of carries himself, and he knows that this pick is so huge for Chinese hockey. But one of the first things he said is, I want someone to break my record. I want someone to be drafted in the first round. I want a Chinese player to be drafted in the top 10. Like, he knows how important his work is. And he's already talked about post hockey kind of going and helping to grow the game in China. But again, for someone that size, right, 6'6", 6'7", 230 pounds, and the way he skates, and probably going to be more of a shutdown defensive type of defenseman, probably not much offensive production. But if he hits, you're looking at an absolute monster on the blue line to go with Sam Dickinson, who the Sharks drafted last year, 11th overall. You look at like Muka Madulin and some of the other picks. That is just a big blue line for the Sharks. I also do want to shout out Cole McKinney, who the Sharks drafted later in the second round. Actually was kind of projected to be maybe a late first, early second, but McKinney, very good defensively as a center, great in the penalty kill. I think one of those kind of jack of all trade type of players, projects to be a really solid third line and center. And if you have, Celebrini, Misa kind of doing a little bit more offensive stuff and having that kind of shutdown type of player like McKinney, I think McKinney has a pretty good shot to be an NHL player as well.
Free agency coming up this week. The Sharks have a lot of money to spend, maybe the most.
All the money, Gil.
Yeah. So what is the plan for Greer in free agency? Any targets? And how much money do they have to spend to get to the floor even?
So the Sharks currently have $44 million in cap space right now. Projection, you're going to have to spend about 20 to 25 to safely get to the floor. So I do expect Greer to kind of, he did say, like, we want to make this roster better. Expect him to target the blue line, but he also doesn't want to give out massive, 6 or 7 year contracts, especially with the prospects coming in. So I think Greer is going to try to maybe more of a lot of the middle class of free agency to try to kind of bolster up this team, right? Give some more support to the forwards and guys like Celebrini and Will Smith, right? Maybe try to find a guy who can help Will Smith along on the second line, as Will Smith is projected to kind of at least be the 2C this year. But if Smith doesn't work out, I think having a backup plan for in case Smith isn't quite ready to be the 2C, they're there. But I expect them to go after, try to find the bolster up this defense. They're also going to need to find a backup goalie behind Askarov. There are a lot of holes. Like, there's plenty of ways to spend the money. I'm just curious to see how Greer does it, because again, that's a lot of money. And Greer said he doesn't want to give out 6 or 7 year-long deals. So I am curious to see how he's able to kind of navigate that. But like I said, I would expect a couple defensemen as somebody who can carry the puck or at least get the transition moving, because that's been a huge issue for the San Jose. Maybe Bo and Byram. I've heard that they're interested in Bo and Byram from the Sabres, but we know the Sabres kind of want to make more of a hockey deal, and the Sharks don't really have a ton of guys I think they're willing to give up on the roster right now. Like maybe a guy like Mario Ferraro or something like that as a centerpiece but you still have to probably give up some futures. I think that's where the Sharks have their most of their kind of assets is in futures right now. So
do you think they might acquire some quote unquote bad contract veterans as a stopgap?
Talking to Greer last week, he said that's not kind of plan A. I think that for them, they want to try to, again, like he wants to try to get the roster better. And I know you're trying to ship off some of your Isles contracts to McGill, but I think that's kind of more of a plan B. And if they get to August and they realize like, hey, we really need to maybe bring on a bad contract here and take back an asset, that might be something that they look to do. But I think for Greer right now, he wants this roster to take a step this year, right? And with Celebrini and Smith entering year 2, with Eklund in year 3, and with Askarov in that, I think there's legitimate reason for the Sharks to try to make like an Anaheim Ducks type jump, where just be competitive for a good chunk of the season, maybe not in the playoff hunt, but just be a more competitive team this year. And I think that's the plan for Greer.
All right, JD, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Of course, you can listen wherever you're listening to this podcast. Just search for Locked On Sharks. You can find us on YouTube as well on Locked On Sharks. You can find the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Locked On Sharks. Find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at My Fry Hole.
All right, JD, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Gil.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Predators, Ann Kimmel. And there weren't too many teams busier than the Nashville Predators at the NHL Draft. What was your first impression of how the team did?
That's such a hard question to answer. You and I were talking before we started the episode about how difficult it is to evaluate a draft in the moments after. I will say that I think some of the picks were surprising, but I do think that there is an avenue that Barry Trotz is looking down, and these picks are very much headed in that direction. So I do think that they made some interesting picks. I think they made some surprising picks, but I don't know that that's entirely bad for the Predators.
So what is the avenue that Barry Trotz is looking to go down?
I really think when you look at the draft and the selections that the Predators made, it almost feels like this draft was very heavily influenced by what we saw in the Stanley Cup Finals and by the style of play that the Florida Panthers executed all the way through the playoffs. And I do feel like that really is influencing maybe the direction Barry Trotz went with some specific picks as far as the physicality of the game and being sturdy in the game, not just offensive prowess, but also, really looking for players who are going to be sturdy and physical in the game. So it feels like some of these picks were made more specifically because Barry Trotz feels like that is the direction the league is going in. That's the direction you're going to have to play if you're going to be successful. And I feel like it's reflected in some of these picks.
So out of the picks, who do you think fit that description the best?
Great question. I am a Brady Martin apologist. It was a very surprising pick, even for me, who has liked this young man for a while. This was a surprising pick because Barry Trotz had James Higgins. He had Porter Martone available as well. But I do think Brady Martin is a great example of that Florida Panthers style of pick. Now, he is known for his physicality. He is known for that motor always running. He compares himself to Sam Bennett, that style of play, that kind of hunger for the game and always moving. He also has an offensive upside that I think that physicality overshadows. And I think that balance may be something that works well for the Nashville Predators if they're really looking to play more of that evolving style of hockey.
And how about the other 2 first-round picks? You go with defenseman Cameron Reed and then Riker Lee, a forward. Where do they fit into the organization eventually?
Cameron Reed is a really interesting pick. The Preds traded up for him. He is a defenseman, but here's what I think is interesting about him. He has such an offensive upside to his game. And one of the things that the Nashville Predators fan base, and I'm certain the front office is aware of, is that Roman Josi is getting a little bit older. He is hockey old, I guess is what we want to call it. And so the franchise really has to start being mindful about what will this team look like? What will this franchise look like when Roman Josi opts to retire? And this is somebody who is the offensive defenseman. He is the quarterback of the power play. He's a Norris Trophy winning defenseman. I'm not saying Cameron Reed is the next Roman Josi, but I am saying the Predators want somebody of that same type, that same mold to be in the pipeline for the future without Roman Josi.
And as far as the prospect pool overall is concerned, what is the greatest need right now and what is the strength?
The greatest need is hands down centers. That was something we knew with the 5th overall pick. One of the questions about Porter Martone is this is a fantastic player and a goal scorer, but he's not a center. And the Nashville Predators, there is a void in center depth for this team now and also in the pipeline. So I think that was something that they wanted to address. They selected a lot of defensemen, which is something in the pipeline that they knew they wanted to sort of restock in. So I think that's reflected in the draft. Nashville is great at developing defensemen and goaltenders. People still question how they do developing wingers and centers. So I think that that's going to be the question Nashville has to answer in the near future. What are they going to do with the talent that they have, the offensive talent that they have? Can they develop them into top tier NHL players? That's going to be the biggest challenge for Nashville when it comes to developing the players in the pipeline.
Free agency starts Tuesday. How much cap room do the Preds have, and what do you expect them to do after a few things they did last year didn't exactly work out as hoped?
Yeah, I think everybody is very cautious when it comes to free agency this year. July 1st, 2024, it was a party in Nashville, friends. I will tell you the season, not as festive for the Predators. I think Barry Trotz believes that last year's big free agency fish that he signed are going to turn some things around, but there are still needs that he has to address this offseason. I think the most important thing is defensively. The Nashville Predators need a top tier defenseman to play with Roman Josi. People are tossing around some names. I don't know how tempting Nashville is when it comes to the free agency market when you look at how things went last year with the player additions. So I think it's a little bit of a sell for Nashville this year if they want to attract that top tier defensive talent or that top tier talent. I also think Barry Trotz is going to be shopping around again for a center. We really like Marco Rossi and think he could be a great fit here in Nashville. It's going to be a question of whether the Nashville Predators want to dig into all that it would take to tempt Marco Rossi and to get things worked out with the Minnesota Wild. That's a whole different situation. So I think they're going to be looking for some center depth. I think they are going to be definitely looking for a defenseman. It's going to be interesting to see how tempting Nashville is this year, though.
And how much cap space do they have to work with at this point?
That is actually a great question. They don't have as much as they would like to have. And I will tell you one of the reasons why is they are paying Matt Duchene $6.5 million next season. It's the peak of his buyout. They're paying him $6.5 million to score goals for a Central Division rival. So that is taking up some space for the Nashville Predators. They are willing to spend. I think Barry Trotz is willing to spend up to the cap because he does still believe that this is a team, if he can put some pieces together, could be competitive now. Again, you've got to get the talent here. You've got to be able to afford the talent. And then you've got to compete with that talent in a really tough Central Division.
If this team doesn't show market improvement in this Barry Trotz's second year as GM? Does the seat start to get a little hot for him?
I think it does. I think that it does. And it's interesting because Barry Trotz is very generous and understanding with Andrew Brunette, who was kind of on a hot seat at the end of last season, and I think will be under the microscope at the start of the season. Barry Trotz has a lot of grace for him because this is a new-ish head coach, and he wants to develop a coach. The flip side of that is Barry Trotz is a new GM.
Right.
And he is going to have to figure out how much ownership is going to have grace for him as he grows into a very different role. I do think he's going to be on the hot seat. I think it will go a long way if last year's free agency signings, Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, Brady Shea, really come in this season and find their footing and are successful. I think he needs to make a couple of moves in free agency that pay off right away. That's going to cool the temperature just a bit.
And what do you think it takes to get these free agents who disappointed a year ago to reach their potential or their expectations this year?
I think some of it comes down to something as simple as a metaphorical saging of the locker room. I think that you had two players in Marchessault and Stamkos who both wanted to stay where they were. And that's tough. No matter how great the money is, no matter what kind of term you get on a contract, there is a component of you are uprooting your family and you're leaving a team that you thought that you were going to be with. So I think a little bit of time will help with that. I think also internally, hard conversations have to be had among the players and with the coaching staff when it comes to expectations. So I think a lot of it is familiarity. I do think time will help some. But Barry Trotz also needs to make a couple of moves to really give this roster just a little bit more punch to take off. It's going to be important for the Predators to have a good start to the season. So there is some pressure on these guys to turn it around really quickly.
All right. It's going to be an interesting off season. I know that. And why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
You can find the podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We are, of course, also on YouTube. You can follow the podcast on social media at LO_Predators. I'm on social media at AnnK_Mama on Ice. And my fabulous co-host, Emma Lingen, is on social media at Emma_Lingen as well.
All right, Ann, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I want to thank my guest, David Morassutti of Locked On Leafs, JD Young of Locked On Sharks, and Ann Kimmel of Locked On Predators for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we're here every day, Monday through Saturday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the hockey world. So make sure you hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.